Okay, welcome, Paul, and thank you very much for being with us during our 12th Future Leaders program here at the SOAS Development Leadership Dialogue. Over the past few days, we've been exploring economic development in Africa. We've looked at how countries across the continent can respond to changing development pressures, ranging from climate change to the shrinkage of traditional aid funds to geographical uncertainties and the transactional pressures around access to critical minerals. You've generously shared your expertise on mineral value chains and equitable resource-based industrialization in Africa. And we'd like to kind of probe a little bit more of your expertise around those issues. So to start, the first question we'd like to ask you is, despite the continent's vast mineral wealth, mineral commodity booms across Africa have led to far less domestic reinvestment and structural transformation than many had hoped for. From your perspective, what have been the main constraints?
By far and away, the main constraint is that the mineral sector is foreign owned. So nearly all of the resource rents, or the surplus, leaves either legitimately through bad contracts or through illicit financial flows, which are enormous. They estimated at more than the total FDI and ODA, the IFFs. So the core problem is foreign capital. What's needed is domestic capital.
And I have studied this from a mining tax regime perspective. It's probably is one mechanism why domestic ownership matters, especially state ownership, is that it's much more difficult to evade tax through illicit transfers if there were more domestic ownership. Is that one mechanism through which?
Well, obviously, there's no use if you're in the same tax jurisdiction, meaning you're local. There's no point in transfer pricing or mispricing. There's no Zug with 5% tax. And the second is, of course, related to the first, is the domination of foreign firms also leads to the capture of elites into then a unholy alliance that guarantees future loss of surplus.
Okay, related to that, despite the challenges you've outlined, are there signs that this pattern is shifting? For instance, through industrial policy, development corridors, and regional strategies. You've been closely involved in many of these efforts. What are the countries or initiatives that you see breaking this historical mold? What specifically are they doing differently to turn mineral wealth into domestic industrial development that others could learn from?
Yeah, unfortunately, the prognosis is not good. The kind of blueprint came out in 2009, which was the Africa Mining Vision, which showed how one could use the mining license to localize, and the trailblazers had been the hydrocarbon countries, the Gulf, localization, Norway, etc. But very little has happened. South Africa did move on quite a revolutionary Mining Charter 3, and then it was squashed by the industry, the Chamber of Mines, who took it to court on a technicality. Mm-hmm. And then we had COVID and things. And then the new act, it's quite clear, is captured. So something's happened where the foreign capital has become more powerful, possibly due to the enormous mistakes in other areas, in logistics, for instance, and energy by the regime. That's kind of increased the power of the foreign mining capital. And the other one was, the AMV and then the EGIM's alignment has been extremely slow. The only new thing that's come out that there's more hope for, where it's more of a strategy, is in the SADC regional mining vision and the Africa Green Mineral Strategy calls for a massive venture capital fund. So far, it's getting traction in that it's been discussed with the EU. There have been approaches to the Arab Bank, and the most important consumer and the most important partner would, of course, be, today it's China. If there could be a partnership between access to strategic or critical minerals and the development of African capital, which is kind of a contradiction because foreign powers usually, they want to control the production. So it's going to be very difficult to finesse.
I mean, one of the countries that you've already touched on South Africa, but one of the countries that's grappled with these questions for decades is South Africa, where beneficiation and domestic processing have long been central policy goals, yet have proven difficult to realize at scale. I mean, based on your experience, what separates credible beneficiation strategies from those that struggle to get off the ground?
That's not really the issue. I mean, what you're asking, the simple answer is just, what are the costs? Is it electricity intensive? Well, don't go that route with the destruction of power in South Africa. That used to be an advantage, one of the cheapest. So, really what makes it credible is viability. And then you look at what are the cost drivers, which then depend on the process. Is it pyrometallurgy or hydrometallurgy, etc. But overall, South Africa has gone backwards. During the racist period, it developed these racist mining houses, which were a bit like chai bowls or zaibatsu. They were highly diversified. They owned banks and all kinds of things like Anglo-American, De Beers, JCI, Anglo-Val. There were lots of them. So there were these, they were called, it was mining houses. And then for a moment of craziness, the new government allowed them to leave and relist. So they promptly then deindustrialized the country. Because once they hit the new shareholders in London or wherever they relisted, they wanted to maximize returns. And the new shareholders said, no, core competence, go back to dirt digging. Don't get involved in low return mining machinery or downstream. All of those have lower returns because there are no resource rents. Sure. So they've become dirt diggers. And that has really impacted. There was massive deindustrialization because of the destruction. And part of the reason is no one recognized them. They were so angry with them after liberation.
Who's they?
In general, politicians in South Africa, everyone was angry with them because they were they were based on colonial racism. Only whites could get mineral rights. Only whites could get capital. So there was such anger, the baby was thrown out with the bathwater. So, and then, of course, the main driver was ideological, coming from that whole ludicrous end of history, everything free market, and then allowing them to leave was seen in terms of, free movement of capital, all things just don't interfere and the market will preside over all good things. And of course, the opposite happened.
I mean, it's interesting what you said. I just wanted to kind of expand on this a little bit, because I think it's an interesting debate and development, especially in political economy. I mean, from what you've said, I mean, a lot of people focus on the global or the constraints that the global north or multinationals or superpowers place on middle-income countries in the global south. But from from what you're saying and for what I kind of read in my limited knowledge of South Africa is that there's a lot of internal political dynamics that made a difference to why the capitalist class became less patriotic. It wasn't inevitable. There were a series of policy choices and political choices, like, for example, not subsidizing experienced white manufacturing groups in South Africa for completely legitimate reasons. But a lot of the failure or a lot of the reasons why neoliberalism and deindustrialization were tolerated have to do a lot with the politics of the transition away from apartheid more than the global north. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, and it's rather depressing because I saw the same happen in Zimbabwe. Yeah. Rhodesia had developed these value chains quite well, all the way through to, steel, etc. A lot of it was due to sanctions, etc., but that fell apart as well because it was seen as disgusting white capital. Yeah. No one saw it except for a few, like the old permanent secretary, Sam Gaza. He saw capital goods as being, treasure. Sure. But most of the politicians just, it's owned by a settler, It's not valuable. We don't care if it goes because it's not owned by an indigenous person. And South Africa's, that's been totally true.
It's interesting, but I do think, we'll leave that point there, but I do think there's this interesting and really underexplored analytical and policy-making focus on how the external and the internal political economy interact. There's a lot of careful work that could be done that hasn't been, that I think might lead to some interesting new analytical ways of thinking about constraints in countries. So there is maybe a bias for hope, as Albert Hirschman might say. Possibly.
I'm seeing early signs, yes.
Yeah. The global green transition has dramatically increased the demand for critical minerals. I think everyone would agree with that. Placing African producers at the center of an intensifying US, China, and possibly EU competition. In this new geopolitical moment, do you think African governments are in a stronger position to negotiate more strategic deals? And what determines whether this surge in demand translates into deeper industrial linkages and value creation, rather than simply reinforcing African states' role as material exporters, raw material exporters?
To your first part, obviously it adds, right? The first time round, of course, the whole of Africa was under European control. So decisions were obviously made by, London, Belgium, Paris, etc. We then tried to redefine that under neocolonialism, and we failed miserably because they still held all the cards. Then we moved into the very, very bad period of a decreasing intensity of minerals in a unit of global GDP from the late 70s. And we saw, obviously, prices respond. We had terrible prices. And that's a period that you could also call the 20 years a failure of global growth. And then finally, Asia comes. So if you look at it as a curve, it goes up, the intensity to the 70s, then it flattens, you have failure, and then it goes up, it continues, because it's now Asia that's happening. So we had a failure of global growth. It kind of stopped for 20 years, and that's when mineral prices just became, that's what, in Zambia, $2,000 a ton for copper, and the long-term price of iron ore, FOB, Saldanha, was $25, coal, similar. So it was a tough period because the rich world had moved into their growth was in services. Yeah. It wasn't in greater consumption of minerals. So we are seeing a prolonged, I think it's going to be prolonged because it comes down to per capita, and just China is 1.4 billion, and India is 1.4 billion, and ASEAN is 1 billion. I mean, this just completely dwarfs the old white world, of Europe and its settler colonies. So I'm optimistic that this demand will continue. But whether we can get out of these huge surpluses basically serving to capture African elites, it becomes a kind of a vicious cycle. You know, once they're in hauling the stuff out, it's so easy just to capture elite. Yeah. If you look at one mine in Congo, Tenke Fungurume, you know, and you look at its total resource rent, you could buy the whole of the Congolese government several times over. Yeah. And that's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, the question's about to what extent do we think this geopolitical rivalry is going to break a historical pattern of what people call the resource curse in its broader term, that, you know, elites get captured, they're enticed by very high rates of return and high mineral rents, but nothing else. And I think one of the insights of the resource curse that's quite important is that if elites have income streams or have access to property rights and contracts that provide super high profits, or rents as we call them in economics, yeah, it's very difficult to get them to invest and plump down a lot of money in a much lower rate of return business. And it's no accident. It's not that there are not Norways out there. There are countries that have had, and the Emirates are showing that it's possible as well. But it is a very big challenge, and you need a quite either coercive state or very patriotic capitalist class to be able to say, okay, we're going to take a certain percentage of the profits from these high rent activities and use them to diversify into things that are lower return. It's been a big challenge, and I do think that it's not inevitable, but the resource curse does present an important challenge that people need to think about. When you design industrial policy, and most of the elites are making vastly higher rates of return than what could be promised by manufacturing, there's lots of policy tools and sticks and carrots.
You're right for manufacturing, but you're not right in terms of they could make good returns in minerals with resource rents. Right. Returns could be massive, but not in the manufacturing. I mean, you know, manufacturing has very low returns, usually 10 to 20%. While, for instance, iron ore mining in South Africa is over 200% return on investment.
Yeah, we were talking about this in the Future Leaders program this week, about one of the things. So if elites were very interested, I mean, and this is an interesting question, because if governments had a greater geological survey capacity, they would know what's in the ground and they could bargain. Even if you're not interested in the linkages or beneficiation, they could get a much higher proportion.
You'd at least know the value of your product.
I think it's a fundamental question when it comes to Africa. Why has there not been, because that would benefit elites, even if you were not talking about inclusion, it would benefit the elite economic.
It's a very simple answer that's actually that every budget cycle in a very poor country, you have very deserving voices coming from health, we need drugs, yeah, education, etc. And these are all immediate. While geological survey, it'll take you 2 to 4 years to do a quarter-degree sheet.
And train people.
And then you got to train people, do it, and then you publish those results, and you might then get exploration companies coming in, another 2, 3, 4. I calculated for our treasury once. You're talking 15 to 20 years, and also Australia did work on this. It is you're going to get that return very far down the line. So when you're under pressure as Minister of Finance or whatever in any country, you know, looking at the medium to long-term future is you don't have that luxury. You've got to deal with the immediate. There are no drugs. Yeah. There are no medicines in the country. You know, there's no fuel in the country or whatever. But there is one thing, one light that I see, and that is that Asia, because it never went through a kind of acquisitive, plundering, imperial phase like the Europeans, does not have JRCs, those you know,
What do you mean by
the junior resource companies,
Right.
they're usually from the settler republics like Australia or Canada, US, etc. And they come from the get-rich-quick colonial days of gold rushes, New South Wales, California, Klondike, Kimberley.
Yeah.
And there was the investment in earth science, especially in Australia, Canada. And you have these very small companies that can assess geological risk. They are geochemists, etc. And they always get the first pickings. When a country opens up, they go in first.
Right.
And then they're always on sale to the major players and make a fortune. And then they retire, but I've noticed they retire, but they so love the hype. Even though they've got enough money to retire and their grandchildren, they come back in the game because they love the game.
Sure.
And China does not have these. They do not have a history of plundering all over the world. And therefore, China has got to pay top dollar from these guys who've now valorized it. You know, they invested 10 million in drilling, etc. They on-sell it. Well, there was Riversdale in Mozambique who on-sold for, I think it was 2-3 billion to Rio Tinto when they had spent maybe 50 million. So I think there's a possibility there where China said this in 2006, that they were paying more for their mineral, for their growth, than the colonials, the old European colonial countries did. Yeah. They were paying more for iron ore because the old colonial companies, Rio Tinto, Vale, BHPB, were monopoly. They were pushing the prices up. So they were paying over $100 for iron ore, but historically, the West had paid like $20 for iron ore.
That's a very interesting.
So they felt, they actually mentioned this at one of the conference, and I see it's changed now. They're forcing the kangaroos now to sell in yuan.
Is that
no
a
more
affectionate
dollars.
term for Australians?
Yes, they've just been knocked. The power has changed. China is relatively more powerful now. So I see some light there that China would like to have another route of access, which is why the Africa Green Mineral Strategy is saying, let's have a partnership with consumers, such as China, ASEAN, etc., where we can guarantee supply, and in exchange you help us develop African indigenous mining capital. Right. Okay. And when one of your colleagues criticized the AMV and as not really being strategies, there's some truth in that. The AMV, the ADGMs, etc., except where there is strategy is the concept of a indigenous venture capital fund with consumers with adequate capital. That is strategy. And that is the idea there is there might just be a sliver with those countries that do not have the cowboys, who don't have JLCs, right, and who are getting overcharged.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting historical insight that you don't often hear when you compare Africa and Asia's historical trajectory. Lastly, I mean, as you know, the SOAS Development Leadership Dialogue, we aim to break down silos and generate more effective and inclusive development strategies. I mean, you've long argued that mining must be an anchor for spatial development, strategies that coordinate across sectors such as mining, agriculture, and industry. What specific skills or qualities do you think the new generation of leaders who've attended our program this week need in order to coordinate across these sectors? What advice would you give them? And what gives you the most confidence in their ability to manage Africa's mineral endowment more strategically in the future?
Well,
if you had to name one or two.
Well, your first sort of question or statement, the reason minerals tend to be the anchor for development corridors is because they have such high resource rents. Yes. Agriculture just doesn't have those rents. So you can have an iron ore project, and most of them, look at Simondu and others, where infrastructure can be 70% of the capex. Imagine trying to open a shoe factory where you had to pay 70% just to have the rail and it wouldn't make, the returns are too low. But minerals, the returns are so high that they can finance
It's a form of resource
billion-dollar infrastructure, as in Simandou, where it has finance. So that's why you use resources that can put in rail and port and terminals and power and water, all the things you need to exploit. And then that, you can hitchhike on that to open up the sustainable sectors like agriculture, forestry, tourism, etc., etc. So that's the first thing. Then what skills, when we did development corridors, we ran courses. And the main thing that was necessary, whether the person was coming from soft, economics or whatever, or hard engineering or earth sciences or something, was in industrial processes. But what's now being called value chains is that a lot like what Morris and Kaplinsky and that did. What's the value chain on flowers? We had a bit of it today. What's the value chain on cobalt? Well, obviously they bifurcate and so on. What are all, to understand what's made from what?
Yeah.
There is a bit of a problem you have because they're all based on, the periodic table. So it's very important people know where things fit because then everything starts making sense. So also in value chains, etc.
So we need more engineers than economists, possibly.
Yes, but also engineers engineers have all the tools, but they often don't join the dots. I know in China they do, but our engineers often are a little bit blinkered. So I think you need the two, is that economists need to really understand how things work. How is this made? Yeah. And the engineers need to see what the wider implications of the technology are. Yeah. So it's a good marriage. So those are the two, but we used to give value chains because before when we were looking at a resource corridor, we'd look at the whole catchment area and say, right, we'll bring in agronomists, and we found, minerals, or you can just use one guy would understand, or one gal, mineral processes. But we discovered that for agriculture, you've got to get a whole lot. You get to get those. A sugar guy will not know fruit. Then you get a fruit guy, you get a grain guy or gal or whatever. But we did these potential scans, we call them. And you scan to say, this area is nothing, but if we put a spine, low-cost rail spine, and now open it up to logistics, what could be? And that's what we ran the course for that. For people to think what could be. It could be blueberries, as we heard this morning.
Sure.
What are the biomes? What are the areas that are good for irrigation? What about dams? What about all of these spatial? You need to cover all sectors because you'll find all potential within a space.
Paul, thank you for sharing these insights with us. There's much more we could cover, but we'll need to leave it there for now. Thanks again.